Hi, this is Misha, and today's video is on the Ross rifle. I've always found the Ross to be a fascinating rifle. It has both an interesting history and it's mechanically interesting. Now there's a lot out there on these. It's a very long, protracted story as to how these were adopted and then how these were rejected. So I'm just going to kind of hit on the highlights. The Ross rifle is a straight pull, chambered for .303 British, produced in Canada. It was designed by Sir Charles Ross, and his earliest firearms drawings, really, and some early prototypes date back to 1893, that era, and they were heavily based on the Steyr 1888 straight pull. Well, he didn't really have a factory at the time. He eventually did contract with a firm in Hartford, Connecticut to have some rifles built in the USA under contract for him, or with his name on them, I should say. But in 1899 he went to go fight in the Second Boer War, where he met a guy named Sam Hughes, who would kind of be instrumental in this thing. They went to the war. The Boer War was an interesting time. You had a lot of wide open spaces, not much cover. You could see enemies coming, and the enemies there, the Afrikaans, were equipped with 1893 and 1895, but I think mostly 1893 Mausers and 7mm. So they had long range, they were accurate, and they were really outclassing the British Lee Metfords and Lee Enfields of the day. So range and accuracy were important in the Boer War. Well, at the same time, Canada needed more guns. They had old Martini Enfields and Martini Henrys, and so they first tried to buy from England, who didn't have enough to supply them because they were, equipping their troops with the new Lee Enfield, which came about in 1895. Well, then they checked with BSA, and they were just going to see if they could purchase a license to manufacture them in Canada, which was also rejected. Well, Borden, the Minister of Defense in Canada, was just all in all just pissed off with the British. They were being obstinate, so he wanted to make everything Canadian. That's where this Ross rifle comes in. Charles Ross had a sporting rifle, which he quickly adapted to fire .303 and kind of reworked it to be a military gun. He talked with Borden about this in 1901, and in 1902 they signed a contract. Well, the only problem was Ross did not really have a factory in Canada. So in late 1902 he set up a factory in Quebec. In 1903 the Mark I Ross came out, also known as the Model 1903. These are given to troops, but they had a lot of problems like soft springs, poor bolt stops, just general design issues, because it was the first Canadian-made rifle. I mean, they really didn't know exactly what they were doing, and again, it was adapted from a sporting rifle. So 1904 rolls around, the military kind of rejects the Mark I, and that's when this rifle comes out, the 1905, or the Mark II. It's an improvement. It has better springs in it. It has an improved bolt release here. So what this is, starting at the muzzle, we've got a typical blade front sight, and it has a sight hood. Typical bayonet lug, although a little on the small side, which actually would eventually lead to bayonets not being 100% firmly attached and coming off. Got a stacking swivel here. You have a 28-inch medium lightweight barrel. It's relatively light. It's not thin, but not too bad. Got a short upper handguard. You've got very finely adjustable rear sights that can be adjusted for both windage and elevation. Again, remember the sporting heritage on these. As you saw, it's a straight pull. It uses two rotating lugs. Very smooth bolts on these. Interesting thing about these the magazine, it uses what's controlled the Harris controlled platform. Basically, you squeeze down on this, and that releases tension on the follower, and you just dump up to 5 rounds of .303 in, and then release, and then it comes back up. This is a very antiquated magazine system, even by the era. It also has a mag feed cutoff here in the trigger guard. You can pull down on it to turn it on, so that turns the feed off, and then just press down and back to turn it off. Not very useful, but how many mag feed cutoffs ever were? Again, the bolt release is here. I'm not going to pull this bolt out because, like with most stires, it likes to rotate, and for some reason this bolt on this gun hates my fingers. It has bit me more times than I can count, so I'm not going to do that. But it is easy to take the bolt out, but then it's a little fiddly to get apart. Your safety is here on the back, this checkered button, or I guess ribbed button. Press it in for safe. Pull it back out for fire. And you can press it in and lock the bolt when it's uncocked too, to lock the bolt closed. So it has 2 positions on the safety. And finally, in the back, you've got a trap door. Very easy to open. It has a little notch here. You can store a typical Enfield style cleaning kit in there. And that's the Ross Mark II, or the 1905. It was actually about 1 pound lighter than the Long Lees of the day. It is a relatively light, well-balanced gun. But, again, you've got a company that just started making these, and they were typically making sporting guns at that, so there were still problems with the Mark II, mostly with durability. They just weren't as durable as a military rifle needed to be. Also, you would have problems with primary extraction on these because it's a straight pull, and all straight pulls, by the nature of what they are, have issues with primary extraction. That's just kind of the name of the game. So they have sometimes stuck casings and whatnot. These really do have nice triggers. Well, again, this is still the early 1900s, the early 20th century. So the Canadian military acquired the Mark II. There were issues, and by 1909, 1910, there was a big push in the Canadian government and amongst the press, either for or against the Ross. It was kind of a very polarizing topic. And it wasn't only the Ross, there were other Canadian-made pieces of field gear and whatnot that weren't quite meeting snuff. And the British had concerns. They got involved. They looked at the Ross and they voiced some concerns. But nevertheless, this was standard issue in Canada before World War I. By World War I, most of the Mark IIs were retired out of frontline service. They were used by the Home Guard. Some were purchased by Britain. Quite a few were purchased by the United States and used in the USA's training rifles. So you'll find quite a few Mark IIs with the flaming bomb ordnance mark on them, which is kind of interesting. They weren't really used in active service all that much, but they were used stateside as training. If they were used at all in military service, they were used by second line or, and I'm not trying to be racy here, but minority type units who seem like they always kind of got the second choice guns. I know, for example, a lot of the African American units in World War I ended up with the Remington-produced French Berthier 1907 15 rifles as an example. But anyway, so these were in use. Relatively decent gun for sporting, but for military, just not up to snuff. And again, you can read about all the problems. Just as a side note, the Mark II with these 2 solid lugs on the bolt, you cannot assemble the bolt incorrectly and put it back in the receiver. So these are safe to fire. There's no issue there. Well, that's the Mark II. However, then we get into the Ross Rifle Mark III, also known as the model 1910. God, this thing's heavier. Alright, in 1907, Charles Ross came out with the .280 Ross round, which was a magnum round. It was a sporting round, although he had hopes that the military might adopt it as well. Then, in 1911, Samuel Hughes became the Canadian Defense Minister, which basically secured the Ross rifle's future. Like I said, there was a push politically in 1910 to get rid of it, but Hughes had always supported Ross, both the rifle and the man, so once he became defense minister, this gun was secured. Well, Charles Ross had continued to improve the gun. He looked at some of the features, and he tried to make it a better military gun. And that's where the Mark III comes from. Well, starting at the muzzle, we have a different but very similar cap here, cover for the sight. We have basically the same bayonet lug here, same stacking swivel. Now, this is a thicker handguard because we have a 30-inch now, not 28, heavy barrel, or at least medium heavy, but this is thick. It's not so bad up here, but once you get back here, look how thick that is. I mean, that's huge. And the reason that is, along with the receiver being beefed up here, was this was made for the .280 Ross round, even though the military versions were chambered for .303 in the end. So this was overbuilt to fire a Magnum round, which wasn't dissimilar from like 7mm Magnum Remington or something like that. Well, continuing on down, the Harris-controlled platform is gone. Now we have a James Paris Lee style single stack 5-shot magazine, very traditional mag. It can be loaded with chargers now. The previous version could not. The rear sight has been moved to the rear receiver bridge. It's still very much adjustable for windage and elevation. So it's a little bit closer, a little more easily used. One of the biggest changes is this bolt. He actually changed the bolt system again. If you can see here, there are serrations on this lug. And there's two of them, one on each side. The bolt comes in, those serrations lock into serrations inside the receiver, making an extremely strong lockup in an extremely strong receiver with a very overbuilt barrel. So in theory, this was a very strong rifle. And mechanically it was. We'll get to that in a minute though. The safety was changed from that not horrible but not great push button to kind of a flag type. Flip it over here. Now you're on safe. Can't pull the bolt back. We're locked in. Flip it back around. Good to go. Now the bolt stop was changed as well. Instead of having the spring-loaded rod, now we have kind of a 1903 style 3-position here. I like to flip that up. In the middle, the bolt comes out. Down, we have a feed cutoff. So that's your feed cutoff now. And all that does, it doesn't have the mechanics like the other one. It just keeps the bolt from going back far enough when it's on to pick up the next round out of the box magazine. This one has a really nice trigger too. Even the trapdoor on the butt plate is different. The other one's slid, this one's hinged, much like on an Enfield. So very few parts interchanged between the Mark II and the Mark III. Well, this went into service around 1911, and the Ross factory in Quebec, Canada, continued to deliver these to the Canadian military until late 1915. It replaced the Mark II. And in a lot of ways, it is a more militarized version of the gun, especially the magazine system. But it wasn't without its detractions. For one, it's a lot heavier, especially in the front. Most of the weight's in the front of this gun due to the heavy barrel. So while the Mark II weighed more than the long Enfield, now the Mark III weighs considerably more than the SMLE, or short magazine Enfield, which came into use in Britain around the same time as this rifle. So while Canada went to a heavier rifle, Britain went to a shorter and lighter rifle. Obviously this one's a couple of inches longer than the Mark II as well because of the longer barrel. So they're kind of going in the wrong direction. Okay, now into all the hullabaloo. Troops started to get these in 1914 en masse, and problems were uncovered. One of the earliest was the sheet metal magazine, which is basically two pieces put together, could easily be dented, especially on the early ones. So if the mag got dented, you see it's a slick side mag, it would stop things up. Another issue they had was the rear sight's peep was too small, but of course that was an easy one to fix, just go in and bore it out. And another one, somehow a bad batch of steel got into the factory and was used to make bolt heads, so you had soft bolt heads used in some of these Mark IIIs. Which obviously is no good. I don't care how strong your action is, if your steel behind your bolt head you're going to have problems. It would deform, moving back and forth, and over time it would lock up the action. Probably the biggest issue was actually the chambers on these, and the Mark IIs for that matter. What had happened, the Canadian Small Arms Committee had okayed that Canadian ammo, 303 ammo, could be made on the small end, or the minimum end of spec for 303. So it worked fine. They did this for accuracy. But once World War I kicked off and Canadians went over to Europe, the Expeditionary Force, and were fighting alongside the British using their ammo, they discovered that British ammo was oftentimes at the large end of spec, made out of soft brass, and sometimes just crappy ammo in general. So these were jamming. Again, remember, a straight pull has pretty weak primary extraction. On top of that, you've got out of spec or nearly out of spec ammo, and these rifles were made with tight chambers for the best possible accuracy, so you were having stuck cartridges in the chamber, or stuck bolts, or both. Now, remember, you also might have soft bolt head. So, what they had to do is they had to go in and remount the chambers on these. The earliest ones, and I'm speaking about both Mark IIs and Mark IIIs, were marked with an N for normal, meaning they reamed them out from the small Ross standard to the normal British. Well, that still wasn't enough, so they reamed them out to over large, which were either marked with an E or an LC for large chamber. But so they reamed out the chambers for better extraction, and that worked pretty well. Of course, you did lose some accuracy, but World War I, accuracy wasn't near as important as it had been in the Boer War, despite what Sam Hughes and Charles Ross kept thinking, especially Sam Hughes. He seemed like he was the driving factor in accuracy, which just wasn't that important in the trenches of World War I. What was important was being able to take mud and dirt and grime and abuse and be light enough to be used in a trench, and these rifles just were not that. They were long, relatively heavy, and pretty fickle because of all the tight tolerances. That combined with just some poorly made parts, which evidently they corrected, but it took time. I mean, they're trying to adopt a rifle right when they're getting into a World War. Well, in 1915, Canadian soldiers started just ditching their Ross rifles and getting Enfields, even against orders. Well, to speed things up, 1916 comes around. Most of the issues have been worked out of the Ross, but people have lost confidence in it. So in July of 1916, they're ordered out of the field. They're decommissioned. They're taken out of service. At the same time, a few months later, Sam Hughes resigns from his ministry position because of just his embarrassment. And a year later, the Ross Rifle Factory is closed, and Charles Ross goes off to do other things. He lives another 25 years. So, I mean, he has more things to do. But that's pretty much the end of his adventure with guns. So, all in all, the factory was in production less than 15 years. In those 15 years, they produced about 500,000 rifles total, including Mark I, II, and III. And that's the Canadian Ross in a nutshell. I've glanced over a lot of details, but we've got a blog article, and there's plenty of other great stories and even a couple of great books on these. But it is a fascinating rifle. On the one hand, these bolts are very smooth. Triggers very, very nice. And these are extremely accurate. These were winning military rifle competitions for accuracy. They were also both the Mark II and the Mark III, but especially the Mark III were used by marksmen and snipers up through World War II in some instances. So they had their place. And so for a hunting gun, for a sporting gun, they were excellent. But for a military gun, not so much. In the end, Canada ended up manufacturing the Enfield as the long branch in World War II, and that's what they used. Some of these remained in Home Guard units, both in Canada and Britain, all the way through World War II. Some were given to Russia. They were used in Latvia. They were used, like I said, as training in the USA. They got around a little bit. I mean, you got 500,000 rifles out there total. They're not just all going to be scrapped. But yeah, I just really have always found the Ross fascinating. I looked for one for several years and ran across these two in pretty quick succession. This one I just purchased off of Gunbroker a few years ago. The Mark II over here I actually got from my friend John over in Tennessee. I appreciated that very much. It's a good, honest example. Hasn't been molested. That's the thing to find on these, is try to find one that hasn't been sporterized or isn't a sporter to begin with. I wanted a military example. But yeah, we did a video on the Enfield. If you haven't checked that out, please do. But I wanted to show the Canadian 303 alternative to the Enfield, the infamous, famous, whatever Ross rifle. So if you have any questions at all, please post them below. And really appreciate you tuning in. Please continue to look at our videos. This is Misha. Catch you next time.